Counsel for the state, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. About 2 weeks ago, when I stood in front of you, I told you a couple of things about this case, and one was that Natalie Chochrane was guilty of financial fraud, of financial shenanigans, and that she was indeed guilty without any reservation. But we're not here today to retry that case. And everything that the state is telling you about Natalie Chochrane, yes, let's shed some light.
That was me, sorry.
Thank you, Judge. Everything that we've heard about this financial case from Natalie's standpoint is true. She was convicted. She was a participant in the Ponzi scheme. But we're not here to judge her yet again on the financial crimes. We are here to judge her on the murder of her husband. And the state cannot prove first-degree murder against her beyond a reasonable doubt. The state cannot prove three things. The case cannot prove what, the case cannot prove how, and the state cannot prove why. First question, what was Michael Chochrane killed by, or what killed him? And you've heard the evidence over the last 2 weeks that we don't know. The experts that the state brought testified to what they themselves admitted, a definite maybe. Maybe it was the insulin shot, and maybe not. The experts that the state brought testified to, we cannot determine the objective factors, the objective anatomical findings, and tangible demonstrative evidence what killed him. They don't know. The state's expert, Dr. Krieger, said, well, the hypoglycemia due to the insulin administration is a strong possibility, but it's just a possibility. Why don't we know what killed Michael Chochrane? Well, because they did not perform the autopsy. And by the time all these experts got the evidence, Michael Cochrane's body was so decomposed that it is impossible medically to determine what killed him. And you heard the testimony of two defense experts. And you also heard the testimony of my compatriot, Dr. Piotr Kubicek, who is the medical examiner who performs autopsies on a daily basis and who is, I would submit to you, a little bit like Matlock. He is the medical detective trying to detect what is the crime
there was no evidence
that led to the death of that particular individual. All these experts said the same thing. The cause of Michael's
was ready
death
to whoop some ass.
is
Sorry
undetermined.
about the shot. Had to calm it
We
down.
don't know.
So,
The state cannot answer
but
or prove
yeah, so
beyond a
she's just
reasonable
saying, and she didn't
The
want. She
how?
was worried that
How
people
did
might
that
think
happen?
that her and I had some issue.
How did
We
this
do not. So
murder
I was like, I
happened.
hadn't heard that. If you heard that, then
I'm not particularly
Sure.
good with syringes.
we
But-
we three together.
Well, we'll come to that.
Nice.
The state
She said that she was
wants you
afraid
to,
that many
to believe that there was
Tell her-
an insulin shot
Was any
the
injected
reason why they're
into Michael that killed
cause
him.
for the
But then the state also tells you
injections and the things
that it could have been
fails
more
and
than one insulin shot.
I don't know.
Because
We got to
when
get to the
Michael
rubber
arrived
sheet sometime.
at the hospital, his sugar level was 21. And the experts told you that it's impossible to have that type of sugar level without being pretty
Rah,
much
rah. No, I'm just kidding.
continuously shot with insulin. So
Professor Edwards
how did
S.
that
Wood
happen?
Yes.
Well, let's follow the state's
Wait, maybe I
theory.
should be like, yes.
in a summer
This
school
cold-blooded killer
in the summer of
is planning a
1900.
murder of her
I do
husband
not
with the insulin shot.
just know any more than what I have heard.
In that regard,
spoken
she
of
is
it
calling
Maybe.
her friend
Oops, you took it down. I
Miss
was like,
Davis
On the same one, we
asking
at the
for
same
insulin
time.
on the
just
day
looking.
of the injection of that insulin. I might just as well have asked for a gun. Might just as well have
Like
asked
looks
for a
at them
murder
with a
weapon.
side eye and be like, "Shut up, Mr. Bigsby."
Jennifer, I'm trying to kill my
he
husband
didn't say
later
anything.
today. I need the insulin, and I'm trying to kill him with insulin. I need you to bring me some insulin.
Kind of what I.
Is that the action
consequence
of a
Oh,
planning cold-blooded killer?
in consequence
She would
of
get
what
that
she said,
insulin ahead of time.
and that in the morning
Not
the
on the
doctors
day of the
came
murder.
and they were unable
and
to do
involved
anything
two
for
witnesses
her.
against her right there and then, who
concurrent
came here to court
by
as
the
predicted
defense
and
and
testified that
by
yeah,
the
that was
government
and they gave her the insulin.
examination of
And then
the subject
and then-
in hand, visiting the prison.
how on earth
Around the-
did she inject
You
that
can hear me now,
insulin
though?
into
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
Yes.
And
Well,
you
let's
can't hear
look at
yourself
these
in-
facts. Did she approach Michael from
intention
the
and
front when he
deliberate
was
malicious
facing her in the
intention to
kitchen?
commit murder, and therefore upon this
And if she had the insulin injection
H
in
in
her
there, if you knew
hand,
how much I had to change that last paragraph
Wouldn't
to make
he-
it make sense.
have the time to react
how I remember that was Jake.
and say
Jason,
what is
Shane.
going on?
You know, whatever.
Close enough.
But yeah,
Let's
he-
assume for a moment. Then she approaches
I was
him
listening
from
to
the back when he's
records on my
standing in the
phonograph
kitchen,
while turning.
and she jabs him either in his back or his rear end.
Why would you
Well, she
get
has
in
to
bed
have
with
a
them?
couple of seconds to
Well, you'll
inject
find out, I
this,
guess.
this
Oh, gosh.
insulin in him.
After
Basic
the
human
nurses
reaction
one,
would be
Okay.
to turn around and face the assailant, be it his wife or be it
yeah,
some
look at it.
cold-blooded
It even
killer.
has the skull and
stranger.
crossbones on it. That's fun.
She wouldn't have even have time to plunge in insulin into his body
Kind of thing.
without him turning around, and he's
But
an athlete.
that goes
He's this
to
huge
show
guy.
their.
And here is his 5'1" or 5'2" wife, who's injecting him with insulin, and he doesn't react. That's why I said it didn't happen in silence.
Taking their
My
property,
first
right?
reaction would be, "What on
No.
earth
Well,
are you doing, woman?"
when she became
or
the
whatever he calls her.
yeah,
Absolutely.
but
What are
she
you
didn't.
doing?
she definitely did it.
And then
I hope you're staying warm.
somehow he drops
That's-
there in a fetal position in the kitchen. No, that didn't happen that way. Of course it didn't.
Sorry, I was looking
So
at
now
this.
What is that? A piano?
you heard the evidence
Wish.
from
Wish.
It's
at least 4 or 5
STER at the
witnesses
end.
that this type
There's
of
not an
insulin
A.
acts
Oh,
And then when I
In
hung
a-
up the phone, it was you saying,
delayed way.
you haven't already. Thank you,
10
Gabby, so
minutes,
much.
15 minutes,
Um,
up to half an hour.
Kelly will email you.
If I'm
plan for
jabbed,
Friday. The
even by
time will
my
be
dearest wife,
noon. And
or by somebody
um,
else with a substance, and if she is silent, that's one thing, and if she tells me, "This is for you, you son of a gun, I hate your guts, whatnot, here it is, I'm killing you," I would have 10 to 15 minutes, maybe to 20 minutes, to 30 minutes, to call 911, to run to the hospital. I told you it was 7 miles from the hospital he would have been in the, I mean, I know it's February, but he would have been in that
And I've
hospital
been talking for a long time,
sooner
not
than
saying
you can
anything.
say hello.
Mr.
Sooner than you
Fedorowski,
can slap a tick. He would have been in that hospital asking for help, an immediate sugar reaction or sugar injection
the
to
likelihood you're
bring
right
the
and I'm wrong
insulin
is
level
justified.
to some
I don't know
normalcy.
anything. Mattia Ribeiro.
Wouldn't have
Hello.
taken it in silence. He wouldn't have just dropped down on the floor. So how did it happen? Well, the state then gives you an alternative, because now they're changing their theory. That may have happened in bed. Ah, that's a novel idea. Inject him in bed, he would not have reacted? Of course he would have reacted. He would have gotten up and he would have done the same
now,
thing.
from your
He would have taken
testimony,
himself to
you're
the
a
hospital, he
doctor.
would have called 911. He would have probably not been
What
particularly happy with Natalie,
areas are you designated
but that
as a
doesn't mean
doctor?
anything. He could have saved himself.
And by that question, do you
So
have the
then the
title
state changes
of
the theory
a
again.
neuropathologist?
That may have happened upstairs, or it may have happened on the couch. Or he's injected on the couch. Well then, okay, so he doesn't get up, so who takes him into the kitchen and puts him in this fetal position? That didn't happen, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. And how do we know that?
So we have a doctor
He
from
fell
Belgrade
in
and
the
a
kitchen
lawyer from
Because there was one witness,
Warsaw.
and he hit his head against the counter. Because
I'm
there
just
was
saying,
one witness,
the Ruskies are
and that
coming.
was the sister of my client, who told you that she saw a dent, a fresh dent in the counter, the kitchen counter. That's where he hit his head, and that's how he fell on the ground, on the kitchen floor. But not because of insulin injection, but because of some unknown condition that was caused, or may have been caused, by many, many, many different reasons. Now, then, continuing with the
So
cold-blooded
he
killer's
was
action,
actually educated during
she
the Eastern Bloc period.
does not,
Interesting. Hey, Ruby,
anything
Ruby.
but
I had a great weekend. I did a great
call all
giveaway.
kinds of people to the house.
Licensed
Now,
to
wait a minute. You have just
practice
decided to kill your
in
husband.
any state.
He is unconscious,
Yes,
So-
sir, I'm licensed to practice in
and
the
you
state
want
of
him dead.
Michigan,
Let
and
him
I'm
die
licensed in the state of
Don't
New
do
York,
anything.
where I originally
Or maybe put a
obtained my
pillow
license
over his head
back
and kill
in,
him.
I believe, 1982.
But do not
I
tell
believe
me
you said you were
that you wanna
board
kill your
certified,
husband,
and
and then you call
once again, for
two
clarity,
workers
what
right
areas
there
are
to
you
bring
board
Michael onto
certified
the
in?
couch. The sister,
I am board certified
And her
in
husband.
anatomical pathology, in
the
neuropathology,
state trooper and his wife, who is a medical assistant,
Thank you. Do you have
and
any
then
publications?
Mr.
Or
Davis.
have you authored any publications of
Is
any
that
kind
the
related to your
action
field?
of a killer
yes,
who wants to get
in both fields,
away with murder?
both neuropathology and forensic pathology.
No, no.
I have done
And then,
original research.
And again, I told you, that's the
papers
kicker.
with
Then he
some of my
dies,
associates, over
and she
time,
wants to hide
and,
all the evidence,
And I have also
She cremates
authored,
him.
several chapters in
and then
textbooks,
all the evidence is gone. All these Dr. Kubitscheks and
the
everybody
area
else can look at all that evidence. No, they can't, because he's cremated.
and the neuropathology,
That's how you, I guess, kill somebody
trauma in
the way the state
children,
believed
and
it
in
happened.
the textbook
But it
of
didn't happen that
Essential Forensic Neuropathology.
And then the ultimate
Also,
question,
I have,
and the question is why?
authored the chapter in transporting
Throughout this case,
and,
the
chapter
leitmotif,
transporting,
the state's main motif in this case was Michael didn't know anything about this business.
Do you have any teaching experience?
Didn't know anything about Natalie's shenanigans, financial,
over time,
the
Leader.
fraud,
I have been
the
involved
deception,
in Natalie
the lies.
University.
He didn't know
I
anything
served
about it.
as, clinical associate professor at the
No.
Department of Neurology.
I think that
State University
From the very first day,
Medical School,
ladies and gentlemen of the
in
jury, you
Detroit,
realize that
Michigan,
this is not the case.
from, I
But
believe,
let's assume for a
somewhere
moment
in,
that Michael
1988,
is indeed
1987
blind
through,
and doesn't know anything about millions of dollars, hundreds and thousands of dollars. He doesn't realize where all that sudden wealth came from. Doesn't know anything. And then he finally finds out. Let's assume that he finds out. And then the state tells you that he would do what? Well, the state cannot tell you. And the question is, what would he do? What would he do that would be so bad
He couldn't
that would
teach
require
on the
Natalie
college
Chochrane to kill
because
him?
he couldn't drive 25 miles and fool
I
around
mean,
there and do his
scenarios
job.
abound.
The city of Pontiac, where
You find out that your spouse
Okay, now,
is
you
cheating the
mentioned
government,
your
cheating the
day-to-day
investors.
work. What is that day-to-day work?
What do you want to do?
my day-to-day work
Well,
is,
you probably
that
want to say,
legal
come on, let's get a
investigation
lawyer.
that
Let's
is
get an
a
accountant.
statutory obligation,
Let's
and,
try to work it
my
out. Let's
position here
call these
is
investors.
governed by the
Let's
state
try to pay
statute.
the money back.
State statute
Let's
called
file for a
Medical
bankruptcy.
Examiners Act of the
Let's
State of Michigan.
maybe even talk to a
And
friendly
it
prosecutor
requires
in Raleigh County. Maybe you will have to do a
among
little
other
bit of
people
time,
who are involved
but
in
not
this,
run to the federal government and
to,
complain.
open up,
What was he gonna
legal
kill her?
investigation and
Is there any evidence that
what I'm
she
explaining that,
launched this
that,
preemptive strike against him because he was gonna kill her? Or that he was gonna do something to her and divorce her? What?
Finally,
What would be her
Sorry we
motive
started at
to kill him?
the correct
Why?
time today.
She may have been afraid that he would be mad, but to kill him? To eliminate him? From what? From doing what? From going to the federal government? From complaining that my image is so tarnished now in the community that I want to divorce you and you will be penniless and all of that? There's no evidence of that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. What triggered this murder? The state cannot answer that question. But if you had any doubts
All
about
right,
Michael being involved in this scheme, and if you believe that he was, then the state's entire case collapses. Because she, Natalie Chochrane, would have no reason to kill him. Because he, Michael Chochrane, was as involved in this conspiracy as she was. And how do we know it? Well, he was working on these contracts daily, on these federal contracts daily. Even when he was hunting with his little son, he had a contract that he was working on. He was working on the contracts when they were in bed. And I'm not talking about anything sexual here. I'm talking about family. She's watching the TV. He is working on the contracts. Their little son with them, sitting between them, realizing that daddy's working on
You do have a warrant for
on
your arrest.
the
We have a
federal
warrant for your
contract.
arrest for murder today. What?
He signs the checks
For?
from the
A Jacksonville
company.
rapper known as
He has
Queso is among
access to
5
everything,
people indicted on
every
first-degree
bit
murder
of
charges.
information
Mary, we'll start with
that
rapper
goes through
Queso, whose
this
real name
company,
is Hakeem
checks,
Robinson. In one of his hit
contracts.
songs about the murders,
He
but
has
his
access
attorneys
to
have
all
said
of
the
that.
lyrics do not prove
And
he is
besides,
guilty.
is he
Still,
really
investigators
living
say he's
on a
linked to the
different
violent drug
planet
gang ATK.
from Natalie.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome
Ladies
to
and
Crime
gentlemen of the
Circus.
jury,
My
if-
name's Drip Drop, and I'll be
if
your
I
host as
suspected
always.
my wife,
I'm going to give you another short and sweet introduction
We
because
are-
I know you want to jump right
well,
into this interrogation
unless
of
I'm in court.
Queso.
We're
Queso
home.
is a worldwide
We're-
famous rapper
we're
from
together.
Jacksonville, Florida. He went
spend
viral
time
on
together.
TikTok and YouTube.
we communicate.
In one of his hit songs, he says he was post a bed
Wouldn't I
dead.
ask my wife?
Well,
honey,
he's still alive, and he
where's
finds
all this
himself
money
inside of the local
coming
county
from?
jail facing 2
All of a
first-degree
sudden,
murder charges.
I'm not working.
Him
I'm
and quite a
this
few of his friends got
computer
caught up on these murder
tech
charges.
guy. You're not working.
And we're gonna get to
All of
hear
a
what he
sudden
has to say
we're
from-
buying
For
2
first-degree
boats.
murder in 2
Well, the
different
investors,
cases.
you know,
He's charged
yeah,
in the shooting
but
deaths
now we
of
have 3
16-year-old
houses.
Adrian Gay.
Now, we just got back from Paris. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the evidence of incredible wealth, incredible injection, maybe that's a bad word, injection of wealth that Mr. and Mrs. Chochrane had in 2018, 2019, maybe even 2017. And that came from the investors. And the investors dealt with Michael individually, just like his parents. They gave him some $44,000. He knew that there were no contracts. What contracts were they? What contracts were there? He didn't have a clue about some of the business, I'm sure. But he had deep, profound knowledge of how much people invested, who was gonna get paid for what, federal contracts. He had deep, profound knowledge of it. I'm sure there were some aspects of this business that he may not even know about. And I'm sure that Natalie was involved in this. But she is not here on trial for fraud. She's here on trial for murder. Well, let's look at the state's case. And mind you, the state has a very heavy burden, and the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, the state brought the evidence of the pilot who says, well, the flight was canceled. Okay. The banker turned mind reader. He had an idea why the flight was canceled, but of course he didn't. He is mad at Natalie because he had to do all that research for the company and didn't get paid for it, I'm sure. And for him, time is money. So they didn't fly to Lynchburg. Well, Natalie went to a doctor. She was sick. I think that the state attributes all these nefarious things to her, but isn't it just plain obvious from Dr. Halsey's testimony that she was sick? She was sick on Friday and she was sick on Saturday. And what did he give her? He gave her a steroid shot that increases blood sugar. So she's calling her friend, Miss Davis, to get her some insulin to maybe level off the sugar, blood sugar. What's so unusual about it? No, it's nothing unusual about it because she, Natalie Chochrane, had a long-standing relationship with the Davises, who had a misfortune, a tragic misfortune of having a child who was diabetic. And Mrs. Davis came here and told you, no, Natalie never had any insulin. Oh, really? But then when we confronted her with the pharmacy records, she said, oh yeah, Natalie could pick up the insulin, but she was bringing it home. Well, what if you weren't home? Yeah, she doesn't explain it. Natalie could keep it at home. There was nothing unusual about Natalie having insulin. And you know what? The state wants you to believe that this insulin, that bottle of insulin that was found, was the weapon, the murder weapon. That somehow it was punctured and she kept that bottle as some kind of sick souvenir of the murder? Is that what the state telling you? I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you look all you need to look at is this humologue that we introduced in the exhibit, as an exhibit. I'll submit to you that a blind fool would tell you that this bottle is full. This bottle is full. There is nothing in this bottle that has been taken. There's no bubble, no nothing. The bottle is full. I suspect I know what happened, why there's a puncture. All these FBI gentlemen got that bottle and maybe had taken a little sample of what to determine what it is. That may be the puncture. But otherwise, the bottle is full. We're not gonna sit here and speculate. They find a bottle, a vial of insulin that is full 4 months after the demise of Michael Chochrane. And then, that's part of their evidence. Remember Mr. Bledsoe, telling you at the end when we finally pressed him, is there any evidence? Is there any evidence that the bottle that you have was the murder weapon? And the answer was no. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lifelong condemnation of this woman versus complete exoneration is at stake. The stigma of conviction for murder versus letting her go free is teetering in the balance, and the state has the audacity to come here with an item that is not the evidence, and they're trying to tell you to convict this woman of murder based on something that is not the evidence. Is that the case that the state has the audacity to bring before you? Well, let's look further. Chris Davis and at least one other witness, Mr. Treadway, and Penny Lowry, knew that Michael Chochrane was taking all those steroids. Whatever, steroids maybe. Maybe they were steroids. Maybe they were not steroids, maybe they were anabolics. We don't know. Michael was taking substances by the fistfuls. And they can say that, oh, we have isolated one little vial and that was some hormonal thing from Mexico. No, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. He had a cabinet full of medications. He had a cabinet full of that away from the family, away from the cabinet for our place where the family stored the medication. He was getting this stuff online. He had the United States Postal Service box where he would get all that stuff. And I submit to you that this was not some one deal Mexico thing. And there's nothing wrong about Mexico. This was, however, the problem. He was getting substances that were not approved by the American government, by the, the Food and Drug Administration. He was getting substances that were going to increase his physique, his appearance. But my God, they could have done some serious damage and probably did some serious damage. One of them was not even for human consumption, as the children told you. That was just a sample of what Michael Chochrane was taking. And what he was not taking was the medication that was prescribed to him by the physicians. And yes, he had all kinds of conditions for which he had the medications. He had Keppra, he had all kinds of serious medications which he didn't take because he believed that all the doctors were quacks. He believed that they were not the people to be trusted. Chris Davis and Mr. Treadway and Penny Lowry tell him, you have to stop this stuff. You really cannot do this. And what does he tell Penny Lowry? She testifies. He said, oh, retarded Penny, what do you know? I'm gonna do whatever I want to. The state makes a big deal out of, well, Michael not being taken to the hospital. But you have witness after witness who told you that Michael not only believed that the doctors were quacks, but he hated going to the hospital. He vowed to kill somebody if he's ever awakened in a hospital. And why? Because he considered this a waste of time. Now, he had all kinds of problems that he went to the hospital with, And within the last 3 months of his life, he went to the hospital 3 times. October 31st. And then he stayed there for a day. I told him he had all kinds of problems. Then he went back to the hospital with pretty much the same conditions that he had now, and stayed there for 5 days, and then he came out. You've heard throughout this trial that Michael had convulsions, seizure-like activity. He probably had epilepsy. The doctors told you that. He had a brain mass that was later modified into the brain swelling, encephalopathy. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, those are serious conditions. They are not to be laughed at. Those are very serious conditions. He retained urine. He had an enlarged heart. He had an acute respiratory failure. He couldn't even breathe because he had a chronic sinusitis. Nobody is here to desecrate or dishonor his life. He died much too prematurely. He died at the age of 38 years. Not for a moment should you think that the defense is taking his death lightly. No. It's a horrible tragedy. Horrible tragedy. But a tragedy, not a murder. It's a tragedy, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. But with all these conditions, Michael was still doing what Michael was doing. Taking supplements, anabolics, substances that God only knows where they came from. And who approved them? And he was a ticking bomb. And how do we know that? Well, after his second stay in a hospital, at least 3 witnesses told us that Michael's health has deteriorated to the point where Michael was not the same guy. When he was Michael at his best, he was generous, gregarious, going to parties, participating in tough man competitions, lived life to the fullest. He was focused. After his second stay in a hospital, Michael could not find his car in a parking lot. Forget that. That happens to me quite frequently. But that was just one symptom. He could not fix a light fixture with Mr. Davis. He felt confused. The children testified he had constant headaches. He was irritable. He didn't know where he was. Mr. Treadway came here and testified, Michael hated going to Panera Bread with a passion. He hated the restaurant completely. And I know that this is not the case about Panera Bread. But if I hate a restaurant, I'm not gonna set foot there. And yet Michael went there and could not even recognize the fact that Mr. Treadway was wearing the same hat that he's been wearing for years. He was confused. There was something going on in his head that made him go where he would never go, and that made him forget who his friend was, really. Now, the state brought before you those 2 FBI agents who, again, could not contribute anything scientific except for that bottle. And the state closed the case with 2 law enforcement officers who are here today. Have you ever seen a more shoddy investigation that took place in this case? They never talked to the children. And I know that the state will say, oh, this was not that important. It was important. The children's testimony was riveting in this case, and I'll come back to that in a second. They did not even check what kind of medication this man was using. And for that matter, they have no clue about Natalie Chochrane's medication. And, you know, they tried to convict her in part because she lied about her cancer. Oh, that's a low blow. First of all, we have absolutely no evidence that she did not have cancer. We have the evidence that she was going to seek help from the Cleveland Clinic, from Duke, from the doctors, wherever she could. And knowing our medical system in this country, it's not that you're gonna walk into the Cleveland Clinic and you get treatment the same day. You have to have insurance, you have to have all kinds of, you have to go through all kinds of hoops to be seen by a specialist. And maybe when she told somebody, yeah, I have cancer, leave me alone, because she maybe didn't want to discuss her health with somebody, maybe in reality she was checking out whether she had cancer and went to all kinds of doctors and clinics to obtain that health. And the state believes, oh, she lied because she told you that she had cancer? The officers ignored the federal investigation completely. And in the federal investigation, in the indictment, in the forfeiture proceedings, in the federal case, it's the Chochranes who were responsible for the Ponzi scheme. But the indictment didn't come until September of 2019, and Michael was dead. I submit to you that the federal government was investigating them both. They can come here and say, well, I saw some cases where the couples were not investigated together. That's baloney. The federal government investigated them both and would have indicted Michael as quickly as they indicted Natalie for the same offenses, because Michael was involved in this Ponzi scheme up to his eyeballs. Now, let's see what evidence the defendant presented. Remember Nurse Holly, if I pronounce it correctly, Holly, yes, who said that she was at hospice. And what did she observe? Natalie Chochrane was with her husband for the last 5 days and held his hand when he passed away. There's evidence that Natalie Chochrane got into a car with Mr. Davis. Well, the state said, oh no, she didn't drive him to the hospital. Well, she didn't drive him, but she was a passenger in that vehicle driven by Mr. Davis. She didn't drive him because she was too distraught over his condition, but she still got into the car and held his hand. Is that the cold-blooded killer? She also testified that Natalie Chochrane was a go-to woman, and I think that she may have used that phrase, or maybe I have used that phrase, when it came to the emergency situations involving Mr. and Mrs. Davis's child. So Natalie Chochrane would have to have insulin. You don't treat insulin with a water pill, for God's sake. You have to have insulin to treat it. And if she was a go-to woman, she must have had insulin to treat the Davis's child. So there should be no surprise again that she had insulin in her possession. Mr. Treadway didn't want to talk to the police because he believed they were dishonest crooks. And he somehow, by the way, he got scammed financially. So he had absolutely no reason to be friendly to Natalie Chochrane and testify on her behalf. Similarly to all these other witnesses, even her sister got scammed to the tune of about 50 grand, and yet she came and testified for her sister. What did Treadwell tell you? Well, Michael was confused. Michael wasn't the same guy that he had been before. And then Penny Lowry, the retarded Penny, as Michael called her. She told you not only about that fresh dent in the kitchen counter, but Michael wanted to pay her back what she owed on the contract. Michael wanted to pay her back. Michael was dealing and wheeling with the money from the investors. He knew about it. She told you, again, the same story, that Michael refused to go to the hospital because he was going to kill somebody if he went back to the hospital and woke up there. And we have all these discussions between 5 or 6 people after Michael collapsed in the kitchen. And then I told you that the children testified in a riveting way. And you're gonna tell us, well, the state probably will tell you they're coached, or they were somehow not truthful. Two tragic figures. Two children who were young enough to be taken care of by father and mother, and old enough to know what was going on around their house. Nikki testified here unequivocally that her father had headaches, he was confused, had a brain fog, was agitated. In a true, genuine, heartfelt way, she told you that he may not have been as loving towards her as he was towards their son. Michael had a heart-to-heart with her shortly before he died, and her impression was that her father felt it coming. And what was it? It was death, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Michael felt it coming, and he had this heart-to-heart conversation with her, which she considered heart-rending, and which we would consider his farewell to life, because he knew that there was something irreversibly wrong with him. The MAC, their son, testified too. Dad worked on the contracts all the time, even when hunting, even in bed. And he testified about their lifestyle. He testified about the supplements, the injections, the dropper, the stuff from Mexico, as he called it. Stuff that wasn't for human consumption. He remembered it all. He testified about his father's anger, his father's combativeness, his father's confusion. Now, I want to talk to you very briefly about, before I do that, there was also a brief mention of nootropics, a medicine that came from some shady, well, maybe not shady, I shouldn't say that, places that usually would not be available in your local friendly pharmacy. There was the smart drugs that Michael was receiving at his USPS, United States Postal Service, box. These were the cognitive enhancers, memory enhancers, stimulants. Michael was perhaps a man's man, and he would not admit to any weakness. He was seeking desperately to look great, to be this, I don't know, alpha male, whatever you call it, to be this great maybe bodybuilder, maybe an athlete. And yet, in all of this, he didn't follow the advice of those who should have given him the advice and who he should have listened to, and instead did his on his own. Now, I want to return for a second to the experts who testified in this case. Let's start with Dr. Kubitschek. All of these experts, by the way, had a number of autopsies that performed. But who was in the best position to tell you about the autopsies? Who was in the best position? Of course it was Dr. Kubitschek. He performed the autopsy the earliest. And with all the help of the state resources, and relatively early in the game, when the body was not perhaps yet decomposed to the point that nobody could recognize the organs anymore, he told you that the cause and manner of death was undetermined. Then there was Dr. Howley, who was not necessarily an expert, but he told you a couple of nice things. One is of course, about Natalie being sick, but he also said something about tablets, the pills, and the state jumped on it. And now the state submitted another theory that maybe Michael was killed by Natalie with pills. For that matter, the state is bringing another theory now that maybe she killed him with the benzos. You heard about the benzos. Now the state says maybe there were 2 shots of insulin and maybe more. Now the state tells you she killed him in the kitchen. No, she killed him in the bedroom. Now she killed him with the prednisone, maybe. And then maybe any other substance. And the state will stand up at the end and tell you that whatever I tell you is a bunch of nonsense. But, ladies and gentlemen, you've listened to the evidence. If the state stuck to its theory that there was 1 insulin shot, I could buy it. But now the state quietly is telling you, well, we're not telling you that the evidence suggests that the defendant killed her husband with insulin. There may have been pills, there may have been benzos. They're intimating this because they don't have any direct evidence, to which they immediately admitted, but they don't have any circumstantial evidence that fits either. Now, you had Dr. Dragovich, who told you maybe one very important thing, and that is that the decomposition of the body caused the inability of any doctor, for that matter, to assess objective factors, objective anatomical factors, and the findings of any type of specific, concrete reasons for Michael's death. That is impossible. Dr. Uribe believed that there was an insulin shot, but this was just an assumption. It was kind of a bridge to the unknown, and I think that was his phrase. It was just an opinion. Dr. Krieger said, well, we've excluded maybe all the other options, but it's a definite maybe, as we call it. It's a definite maybe. Maybe there was an insulin shot, but we don't really have all that information upon which we can construe our theory. And then Dr. Banerjee came here, and she said, we don't know. She's our expert. Maybe you expected her to say, oh yeah, that was an insulin shot that was responsible. That was some other reason. She didn't say that. She testified like four other experts that we really don't know. But there are other possibilities. There was something wrong with Michael's pancreas. Remember that? He may have had pancreatic tumor. He obviously had an enlarged heart. Arrhythmia. Maybe there was something wrong. Maybe that was the reason. The tests were not done on any C-peptide insulin. No meaningful diagnosis from the sliders that were obtained or that weren't obtained. Could have OD'd on benzos. We don't know. Benzo overdose, maybe poisoning. Hypoglycemia equals death. Well, all of that. And then, of course, there are other reasons. The medication, alcohol, unexplained medications, liver disease, sepsis, surgeries, immune system. All of this could be taken into account in Michael's death, but the state stubbornly believes that Michael's death was caused by that one insulin shot, which they, by the way, changed and modified to maybe 2 or 3 on all these versions. It's impossible. Impossible, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Now, the state also brings a theory of maybe there's this voluntary manslaughter, that just because she didn't take him to the hospital. Well, I submit to you that not taking Michael to the hospital was not done over the period of days. It was a matter of hours. It was a matter of discussing Michael's preferences and will, whether he was going to go to the hospital, whether he wanted to go to the hospital, and what was necessary. We had several people in that house who could have decided. Finally, it was decided that Michael was going to the hospital because he was not waking up. Yes, it took some time, but there was always the hope that he would wake up in his own home, surrounded by family and friends, and everything would be fine. After several hours, yes, it became necessary to take him to the hospital. But that's all. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I told you at the very beginning of this case that this is a complex case. That this is a case that involves medical, banking, scientific, maybe pharmaceutical, maybe business, evidence and information. There are aspects of federal litigation here. And you've heard it all. But distilled to its essence, this case really involves the state's attempt to equate the federal prosecution and conviction for dishonesty and fraud with murder. The state says she is a fraud, therefore she is a murderer. She is a cold-blooded murderer because she is a cheat. That's what the state is telling you. But the state cannot prove, certainly not beyond any reasonable doubt, the what caused Michael's death, the how did that happen, and why it happened. And so at the end of this case, I will tell you that the state's attempt to equate the fraud with murder is like trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole. And if that one peg didn't fit, then the state switched the theory, and let's see if another peg that is still square will fit into that hole. Oh no, it won't. Well, then we'll switch to another theory. Maybe benzos, maybe two shots of insulin, and it still doesn't fit. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state will have the last word. In the criminal process, I will sit down and I will not address you again. My esteemed colleagues and friends will get up and tell you that whatever I told you is nonsense. They will give you the spin on the facts and tell you that's the way it is. But I heard a statement once that, and of course when you go to the jury room, since they spoke last, you will have their words in your mind, in your memory more than mine, than my words. But I heard a statement once that it's not the one who speaks last, or trust not the one who speaks last, but who speaks the truth. We have no reason to come here and hide anything from you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Ms. Chochrane should not be perhaps invited home for you to have dinner with her on Sunday. I told you that. She is committed crimes of fraud, crimes of mail fraud, crimes of dishonesty, but that doesn't make her a murderer. And if you cannot answer these three questions, what, how, and first of all and foremost, why, then the state fails to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why we're asking you to find her not guilty.